Well, this slide could have gone with the introduction that Bharat gave. So, most of my scholarly work for the last 35 years has been focused on the great narrative traditions of India, and especially Ramayana, and especially Hindi Ramayana. And I did write that book, Life of a Text, which was actually the revised version of my PhD dissertation at Chicago. So another U of C connection. And then the Hanuman book and the forthcoming, the first 2 volumes of the Tulsidas translation will be out in the end of this year, coming out at the end of this year from the Murthy Classical Library of India series. So what does all this have to do with chai? To some people it might seem like I've sort of gone from the sublime to the ridiculous, or at least the very mundane. But I decided some years ago to take a tea break from thinking about Sri Ram and Hanuman and all that and their friends, and explore something that had been a fascination to me ever since I first came to India a long time ago, 1971. And in a way, I think of it as being a continuation of my work on the Ramayana and on Hanuman. I think of it as being the third part of a trilogy. If I actually write this chai book, which right now it's on back burner, but it would be the third part of a trilogy of 3 things that are beloved to the people of North India. The Ramcharitmanas, Hanuman, and chai. And they sort of, in a way go together. But I am interested in what Arjuna Padurai famously wrote about as the social life of things, and the study of commodities as a way of looking at culture. And, in a sense, I'm a cultural historian, and what I found when I started to study chai was that it's a very good lens for looking at the 20th century in India and changes that have occurred in urbanization, in transportation, in commodity culture, the availability of commodities, eating habits, social practices and social space, marketing. You're going to see examples of all of this in this talk. My story with chai begins back in 1971 on my first trip to India. That's me on the left, upper left there, sitting outside a chai shop in Raniket, in what's now Uttarakhand, then Uttar Pradesh. And I very quickly succumbed to the cry of the railway vendors, chai, garam, chai, and became absolutely addicted. And it's a habit that has always continued. And even in Iowa, I get my Ctc strong, at the local Indian store, and continue to make chai for myself every morning, adrak, with adrak. But, originally when I first came here, I just assumed that chai had always been around. I just thought it was like the Vedas or something, it was part of the landscape and had always been there. It didn't really occur to me that it had a history, and particularly a modern history. So it was when I started learning that I decided I wanted to do more research on this. So I'm going to take you through, as it were, a series of chapters in the book that I may someday write. And they all have to do with making. They all have the theme of making tea, of course, but also making changes in lifestyle and habits, making money, because there's, of course, a very important commercial aspect to all of this. And really kind of making culture. I'm interested in the culture of chai, and I'll get to that later. So the history of the introduction of tea in India is not something that I'm going to go into in great detail today, because it's been written about a lot. Whoops. There's lots of books on it that you can read, and there have been lots of books and articles. I've put some of the sort of not a timeline, but a series of time points up here. from the fact that the British get the tea habit in the late 17th century by way of a Portuguese princess who marries into the British royal family and brings the habit of drinking tea from Portugal to Britain. The East India Company uses India as an entrepot for the China. The tea is all coming from China at this point, and India is a point on the transport route, bringing tea, and it's being traded for opium. This is a story that many of you know from grown in North India in big plantations. Around the end of the 18th century, around the 1780s, 1790s, the East India Company gets very interested in the possibility of growing tea in India and breaking the Chinese monopoly on the product, on using land that they now, of course, control politically. And it's largely unsuccessful. The attempt to introduce the Chinese variety of tea is by and large unsuccessful, but in 1823, they discover that there's this plant in Assam which is almost exactly the same as the Chinese plants. It's slightly different. It's known as Camellia sinensis assamica as opposed to Camellia sinensis. It's got a slightly broader and longer leaf and a little bit different flavor, but it's essentially the same plant. They don't figure that out, by the way, until 1834, but they then, very rapidly, British entrepreneurs begin cultivating tea in Assam, and the first shipment to London, which is very small, 40 chests, occurs in 1839, but it creates a sensation on the British market. And you can see how the crop grows very rapidly, 1842. From the 1840s on, there's this, what I call the tea rush, like the gold rush. Vast areas of land, mainly in Assam, are cleared. They're cleared of forest. Huge numbers of laborers are brought in, mainly from Bihar and what's now Jharkhand area, and many of whom die. It's a terrible story of labor exploitation. But again, this is a history that's been very well written about by others, and it's not my subject at this moment. By 1862, you can see the tremendous growth in the crop, and it just keeps increasing almost geometrically from then on. So that by 1888, India surpasses China as the exporter of tea to the UK. But all of this tea essentially is for export. It's not for domestic consumption. It's not intended for Indians, nor are Indians interested in it at that point, by and large. In 1903, they impose a tax called the tea cess on the growers, and the money is to be used for promotion of tea drinking. Again, not in India. What they're really looking at is the United States. That was the big market they wanted to crack, and Australia. So most of the tea cess money is actually spent outside of India. But a little bit is spent to explore the possibility of there being a market in India. So one of the viceroys, I think it's Lord Bentinck, does suggest to the tea growers, shouldn't we be looking at this market of 300 million throats that is at our doorstep? And so, these are the sort of people who are drinking tea in Calcutta in the late 19th century. The kind of Babu culture, people who work for English firms and have a kind of anglicized lifestyle where they can wear dhotis and coats, But the Tea Cess Committee conducts an initial study from 1901 to 1904. They launch a 3-year study trying to create a little market in the area of Calcutta itself, actually, or Kolkata now. And the results of the study are unsuccessful, and it's disbanded. The effort is disbanded in 1904. And here's a quotation from the the final report, it cannot be said that the results of the 3 years working indicate the existence of a promising market in India. And the commission was at that point disbanded. So, you know, the audience is really an imperial audience, and to the extent that the Indian population knows anything about tea at this point, most people associate it with imperialism and with the power of the Raj. And it's a foreign crop and a foreign product, and a product from which foreigners benefit. This is an ad from the 1911 Durbar souvenir edition of a Delhi newspaper. And it's one of the early examples of a recurring image, or trope if you want, that you find in a lot of tea advertising that I call the garden to table trope, where you have the image of the tea. You know, the tea plantations were called gardens, which gives a kind of a benign and pastoral kind of notion. You see the garden, the geometric, neatly arranged garden being carved out of the jungle, as it were. And there's the factory building in the back, but you don't really see that. You don't really see what goes on at that. And in the foreground, you have the subaltern, a woman, dark-skinned Indian woman subaltern, directly handing the bounty of the earth to the Sab and the Mem Sab seated at the immaculate white table in the foreground. So it's a totally industrial strength colonial image. And in fact, it very much evokes this image, which is a famous painting in the East India Company headquarters in London, done in 1777, which is entitled "The East Offering Its Riches to Britannia." And you have again the dark-skinned Eastern woman with the basket brimming with goodies, presenting them to Britannia. I love it, how she looks so innocently surprised. All this for me? You know, it's a very kind of clever reduction of 2 centuries of oppression, right? And of course, it is very much associated with British imperial power, and tea is actually regarded as a sort of important fuel for the army. And during World War I, when so many tens of thousands of Jawans, of Indian soldiers, served on the battlefields in Europe and other places in North Africa, and died, many of them, they, of course, were regularly served tea. And so you did have a little bit of kind of grassroots consumption of tea coming out of the First World War, because there were men who came back from the war and brought the tea, the taste for tea and the tea habit back with them to their villages in some cases. But by and large, the class of people in India in the 19-teens, 20s, who consumed tea was very much the anglicized elite still. Very, very limited section of the population. A few other communities, the Parsis, had a taste for tea. But I love the image of the lady who plays tennis wearing a sari and pauses for a cup of tea. And of course, the idea, the tea ads emphasize the elaborateness of the tea ritual, the fact that you have to have all that stuff, all that expensive, complicated stuff to make tea, a teapot and creamer and sugar bowl and all that. Service tea, this proper kind of tea, which I will tell you more about later. What really changes the whole picture is something that happens completely outside of India, the collapse of the international financial markets in 1929 started in the United States, as we've done again recently. And it spreads in ripples all over Europe. And the Great Depression causes the tea market, the international tea market, to fall apart. So that by 1933, the growers in India, who have been continuing to expand the crop exponentially, and they've become better and better at it so that the yield per acre has just gone way up, But by 1933, India is producing 100 million pounds of excess tea per year that they're unable to sell outside of India. So at that point, the growers finally wake up to the possibility of creating a domestic market. And in 1935, the Ctc Committee, which has existed kind of quietly all these years, doing little shows at World's Fairs in St. Louis and other places outside India, the Ctc Committee now changes its name to the Indian Tea Market Expansion Board, the ITMEB, I will refer to it as. And they launch a massive mass marketing campaign, really kicking in about 1936, which they call a public education campaign about the virtues of tea drinking in order to introduce tea to the masses of India. A lot of these materials are in Bengali, but they were actually produced in many languages. You'll see some other examples in other languages, but some very nice ones that I got in Calcutta are in Bengali. The campaign was accompanied by very beautiful graphic signage and commercial art in the form of posters, handbills, pamphlets, newspaper and magazine advertisements. Much of it produced by a group of very talented commercial artists in Calcutta and some also in Bombay. Tea was presented as part of, this is a special Eid souvenir pamphlet that was produced in Calcutta circa 1938-39. And here you see, this is the trope of garden to table again, but notice the difference. The manufacturing process is now emphasized because it's interesting to Indians. There's machinery, there's modern machinery involved. Tea is presented as part of a middle-class modern lifestyle. And you want to see all the spotless equipment that's used in the production of it and the shipping network that is used to distribute it. This becomes a part of the allure of it as a modern product. It's not a traditional product. It's being presented as a modern product culminating with the middle-class nuclear family couple, enjoying their morning tea. Instructions on how to make tea were posted in railway stations and bazaars in many languages. These are examples in Urdu and Bangla. And again, the emphasis is always on what is considered the correct way to make tea, service tea, using a pot and hot water and brewing it and then milk and sugar separate. Part of the reason for that is because you use more tea that way. The emphasis was you have to put 1 teaspoon per cup plus an extra one for the pot, right? I'm sure you've heard of this. And it uses more tea, and this is, of course, important to the people running the campaign. The campaign sent out tea demonstration vans to tour the countryside and hand out free samples, free cups of tea, and also free little tiny paper packets called paisa packs. They were sold for 1 paisa, but initially they were given away, containing enough tea leaves to make a couple of cups of tea as a free sample. They produced some very interesting literature for internal consumption by the several thousand people who were involved in the campaign. This is an example of it, the Indian Tea Bulletin. And it was published for about 5 years and full of articles that have really fascinating rhetoric. It kind of focuses on the word habit, the use of the word habit. And it's used in 2 senses. On the one hand, tea is presented as a good, noble, virtuous habit that has to be, it's almost like a kind of missionary discourse that has to be transmitted to the Indians. And it's going to have good effects on them. It's going to make them more energetic, more disciplined, more punctual, more like Brits, in effect, right? More alert, At the same time, they're aware of the fact that tea is mildly habit-forming. It's mildly addictive. And so there's this other rhetoric that you find in the campaign literature, which vaguely resembles kind of the rhetoric of drug pushers today, where we have to get them hooked on the tea habit so they will come back for more and be willing to pay for it. And we're giving out all these free samples just in order to create the habit that will bring people back and make them willing to open their pockets. They use a lot of other kinds of rhetoric as well. And the campaign is fond of co-opting the rhetoric of Indian nationalism. So you have the phrase national drink is coined, and it gets back translated into Hindi as Rashtrapeya, and appears in the publicity materials. You know, don't you know your national drink? Have you not tried your national drink? You know, everybody's got to have just like you have to have a national song and a national costume and a national language. Well, it has to be a national drink. And so you get publicity materials that focus on different ethnic groups, different regional groups being sort of united, brought together in the act of consuming tea, and of course different religious communities being brought together in highly stereotyped fashion over their cups of tea. Another approach was the idea that tea was good for workers and was going to make workers better workers. So pamphlets were produced for factory and mill owners to encourage them to institute tea breaks in their daily work schedule, and to serve even free tea to workers on the argument that it would make the workers better and more alert and able to continue. This is a wonderful poster produced by a commercial artist named Ananda Munshi. And it's obviously influenced, I think, by Soviet poster art. But it's a wonderful image because you have this woman who obviously is, subaltern. I mean, she's a mill worker working on a power loom, and she's wearing a blouseless sari, which is kind of a code for lower status. But look how chic and healthy and sexy she looks. I mean, she's just glowing with vitality because she's had her 4 p.m. dose, of tea from the mill. Same thing, office managers were encouraged to create canteens and introduce tea into the offices to make the workers to fight the 0 hour, right, 4 p.m., when the workers become lethargic, right, the babus, and you want to keep them working. Okay, well, making tea Indian. What I'm talking about here is that as the campaign continues, British companies such as Brook Bond and Lipton begin to aim at the lower end of the working class and rural markets. And they discover that Indians like very fine grades of tea. That is, they like very fragmented grades of tea, what they call dust. And so dust begins to be distributed in these 1 paisa packets sold as malas on big perforated paper chains. This is the original pay-per-use kind of marketing. It had been used once before for tobacco, and tea is, I think, probably the second product that was sold that way. Now, everything is sold that way. If you go to Kirana stores, you see shampoo and detergent and so on being sold. And they're beginning to become aware of the fact that Indians like a lot of milk in their tea. And they prefer these small particles for mixing with the milk rather than the full leaves that are more popular on the international market. The really dramatic growth in tea consumption comes only after independence. And this is another poster by the same artist. You can see how versatile he was, because here he's not imitating Soviet poster art. Here he's imitating Jamini Roy and Kaligat pot painting in a wonderful way. to make the statement that it's okay to drink tea, because a lot of nationalists had been opposed to it. It was an imperial product. It was, Gandhiji is supposed to have called it, although nobody can find where he said this, but Gandhiji said so many things. Gandhiji is supposed to have called it the blood of the peasants of Assam. Do you want to drink that, right? But take that, Gandhiji. Right, here you've got this image of Mother India, khadi-clad, no doubt, sitting behind the charka, and she's having her cup of tea and giving the message that tea is now not Videshi anymore, Swadeshi, right? 100% Swadeshi and okay to drink. Here are two examples of the garden-to-table trope that I think really capture the change that's happened. Incidentally, the tea companies themselves are beginning to change hands. Indian ownership is coming in more and more. The gardens are going over to Indian hands, so that's important to know. So it's no longer the anorexic first world consumer being serviced by the scrawny, dark-skinned Indian subaltern that you see on the left. Now in 48, it's Nehru era, right? And you have these rather plump, well-fed, wheatish complexioned ladies, both the server and the consumer, and both of their faces are modeled on the film actress Suraya, popular film actress at the time. But it's kind of, prosperity for all and, of course, tea for all as well. The ITMEB undergoes another transformation. It becomes the Tea Board of India, part of the Ministry of Commerce in 1953. And it introduces a cartoon character to promote tea. This little guy with the pot head and 2 leaves and a bud body. And I think probably the inspiration for this was the Air India Maharaja, who was created in 1946 and was really the most iconic cartoon character of the immediate post-independence era as far as advertising is concerned. A man named Umesh Rao created the Maharaja. But again, like Air India, which was at that time government-run, the Tea Board, the images of these large government-run bureaucracies that are at your service, and actually, you can see him with his little buds, doing namaste here to you. But again, the Hindi newspapers and other language newspapers repeatedly carried advertisements giving instructions on how to make tea and how to make tea the right way, and emphasizing that it should be made the right way in order to get the full satisfaction. We'll come back to that. Nationalism, national integration, of course, one of the most important projects of the immediate post-independence era, trying to really forge a strong sense of national identity. Comes back again in tea advertising. This is an ad for the Tosh company in Calcutta, which was one of the first Indian-owned tea blending and wholesaling and retailing companies. And again, this message of, Binar Jati, Binar Makt, is it? Help me, Rebecca. Tosh chai. Shokale ek mat. Everybody is of one opinion about tosh or chai, the diverse castes and creeds. Now, this is very interesting because this is a company. I've interviewed the CEO in Ahmedabad. This is a company that started pre-independence, like the Tosh company in Kolkata, emphasizing be Indian, buy Indian, and has this wonderful logo which first attracted me to it when I found it in a Patel Brothers store in Chicago. This logo of the Pahalwan, who looks suspiciously like Chandrasekhar Azad, who was murdered by the British in 1931. So I don't think that's a coincidence, given this is 1934 that they created this logo. But it's an image of Indian masculine strength, but he's hefting not a gada but a cup of chai, And then you have this wonderful image that goes back to Mughal painting of the Vagh and the Bakri, the tiger and the goat, like the lion and the lamb in Western art, representing the strong and the weak, the rich and the poor, the spectrum of humanity brought together under the shelter of in Mughal art, the emperor. You have Jahangir with the tiger and the goat, or the lion and the lamb sleeping at his feet. But here they're drinking out of an enormous piala, an enormous teacup, and I just think it's quite wonderful. And of course the slogan, Hamesha Rishte Banaye, always making relationships. But what happens, of course, in 2009 is that Vagh Bakri, which has become the leading brand in Gujarat by that time, wants to break out of Gujarat and go into Maharashtra and Rajasthan. And that's what you saw represented in those ads. And Delhi, they also tried. And so you again have the image language of nationalism used to support this very capitalist impulse, culminating in the extraordinary image of the Dharma Chakra of the Indian flag formed from mingling currents of chai, which I just think is really audacious and cool. Yes, but how do Indians make tea? Well, as tea begins to catch on in the 1950s and 60s, Indians largely reject the right way to make tea, as they so often reject various supposedly right ways of doing things in favor of their own ways of doing things. And so the constant admonitions to people to make tea in the right way is a hint to us that that's actually not what's happening. Actually, tea is being made in a very different way, using what the British consider excessive amounts of milk and sugar, and combining all the ingredients together. So when and where did this first happen? Where is the monument to the unknown chai wala? Or maybe it was a wali. I don't know. I've wished that we had such a monument. The person who first realized that you could do this jugaad approach, that you didn't need this service and all this elaborate equipment and everything. You could just throw everything together in a pot with lots of milk, maybe half milk or even more, even 2/3 milk. Put in some adrak or elaichi or whatever, and boil heartily to produce what is called by various names, simply chai or chalu chai, footpath ki chai, aam aadmi ki chai, masala chai, tayar chai, ready mixed chai, etc. The beverage that we all know and some of us love. But the explosion of this kind of tea, which really happens post-50s, it starts in the 60s and goes into the 70s, also involves technology and technological change. It involves the adoption, wide-scale adoption by the tea companies, which are now almost entirely Indian-owned, of a new way of processing tea. And this is the Ctc process, which stands for, in most interpretations, cut, tear, and curl. So in case you've ever wondered what that means on the packets, that's what it stands for. The Ctc machine, an early version of it was invented by a Scotsman named McKercher in 1931, but it was very cumbersome and expensive and prone to break down, and it was not widely adopted until the late 1950s when Indian engineers perfected it and made it much easier to operate and much more inexpensive, and it started being adopted very rapidly. And what it is, I'll just show you quickly how Ctc works. Tea, whether it's going to be processed by the so-called orthodox method or the Ctc method, it all begins the same way. It's picked by hand and goes into withering troughs for usually about 12 hours, where currents of air pass over it and cause the leaves to kind of wilt a little bit. But then, nowadays, 90% of the tea in India then goes into the Ctc manufacturing process, where steel rollers with little tiny teeth on them tear the leaves into little tiny fragments. The leaves pour in between these rollers on conveyor belts, and they're ripped into little tiny fragments, which jump-starts the oxidation process and causes the the full flavor of the Assam tea to really come out very briskly. And then they go through these aluminum drums called gugis at the end, which give that little granular shape, danedar, the granular shape that a lot of people like. The tea is then further oxidized, sometimes on tile floors, a process that only lasts about an hour. And then it very rapidly goes into giant drying machines. It's all very fascinating. These are my own pictures, and it's really interesting to watch and smell. It's very cool. And the chaff, which you see being blown off, there are fans and vibrators, and the chaff is blown off and comes out through these tubes on the side. And it's known as tea waste, and it's not used in India. And it took me a very long time to find out what happens to it, because it's huge, and you see these piles of it. It looks like sawdust. It's huge piles of it, and they're very secretive about it, but I eventually found out it all goes to the West to make instant tea. But they don't want Westerners to think about the fact that they call it tea waste. And it's really not waste. It's just chaff, and it has caffeine in it. It has tea flavor in it. It's just not very aesthetically appealing, and Indians won't buy it. But it gets made into, Lipton instant iced tea. So that's kind of fascinating. Yeah. Anyway, the end result, of course, is Ctc, and that's me with a possibly lifetime supply there. What the Ctc process did, most importantly, is that it produces a very, very strong liquoring product, these little granules, favored by Indian consumers, tea that can really stand up to a lot of milk and can stand up to boiling. It doubles the cuppage that you get from a given amount of tea. So typically, with the orthodox method, you typically get about 200 to 250 cups per kilo. But with Ctc, you get 500 to 600 cups per kilo. So this brought down the price of tea very dramatically. Ctc processing in 1961 was 35% of the crop. It's over 90% now. The Indian crop gets processed by Ctc. And you see it reflected in advertising. Famous Ctc brands like Brook Bond Red Label and Taj Mahal. They both advertise the fact that you get more cups of tasty tea per package. And that was a big spur to the industry. Something that's very interesting that came out of my research is the fact that between 50 and 60% of the market in India has never been able to be touched by the big multinationals. It belongs to little companies, little, family-owned, mom and pop, corner shop kind of tea blenders that do their own tea blending in a small-scale way and have a very loyal consumer base that won't buy the shrink-wrapped products that are sold in the stores. Maybe this is going to change now with the way Indian marketing is changing, but it's been the fact for the last 50 years that the big companies don't even try to compete with these people. They know they can't, and actually many highly placed people in the multinationals told me that the tea sold in these corner shops is better. It's cheaper, better, fresher in every way than they were able to produce, even with their most efficient packaging and distribution methods. So that's kind of interesting. And this is an example of a kind of Indian capitalism that I think contradicts the usual American model, which is, Matsya Nyaya, right? The big fish eat the little fish, and inevitably big companies are going to devour. But the big two, Tata Global Beverages and Unilever now owns both Lipton and Brook Bond. They are willing to concede that, half of the market they can't get at. So that's interesting. The last thing I'll talk a little bit about is this kind of social spaces that chai culture created. I call it making space for tea. And I just have some examples of some of the sort of institutions. In Kolkata, you had what were called tea cabins that were very much an important part of Calcutta's cultural and intellectual life during much of the 20th century. They're now virtually all gone. That's a famous one. It still exists on College Street, established in 1918. Of course, more typical and more grassroots is the street corner adda, the hangout, the little tea shop that's frequented by local neighborhood men. These are largely male social spaces. On the other end of India, you had the Irani cafes of Mumbai.
Hyderabad also. Hyderabad also.
And Hyderabad also, yes, correct. And Pune, a couple of places where there were Iranis and Parsis. Bombay once had 400 of them. Now there are just a handful that are holding on. The real estate has become so incredibly valuable and expensive that you just can't have a place where people buy 2 cups of tea and sit for 4 hours. It's not profitable. You could be selling designer jeans. So, I mean, these stores have faced a lot of competition. In the Hindi belt, we have the chai ki dukans, places where often newspapers were read out aloud to people who couldn't read. News was exchanged, news about the freedom struggle, news about post-independence. This is a famous one in Benares, Pappu Ki Dukan, near Assi Ghat in Benares, celebrated in a Hindi novel by Kashinath Singh. These were new spaces for the exchange of news and gossip and opinions, largely male for the most part, but they also played a role in political discourse and in the breakdown, to a certain extent, of caste and caste-related eating practices that varied from place to place, but it is something that is generally said about tea, that it was a leveler, a social leveler, and it had the effect, because it was a new product, it didn't fit into any of the existing codes, it did have a tendency to encourage free exchange. In Ahmedabad, there's the Kitli culture, often located under big old neem trees, and a culture that encouraged they drink it with cup and saucer there, but often it's shared in what is known as cutting chai, which has become very popular in Bombay as well, where a single serving of tea is broken into 2 or more very small servings, so very poor people can share tea among one another. I don't have time to go into this, but I've collected lots of kind of what I call tea lore, examples of stories, legends, traditions, poems. This is a poem about tea that the owner of that tea shop on Bentnick Street in Calcutta wrote for me. It's very sweet, with the take Suba Ki Chai. Tea in films, of course. Tea as a trope in preparations for marriage. So many husbands first meet their wife when she hands them a cup of tea, in the checking her out phase and so on, right? So it has all kinds of associations for people. Let's talk just a little bit. This is in closing. I'm wrapping up, don't worry. Let's talk about the future of chai. The tea board worries about this, and the tea growers worry about this somewhat. They worry about the younger generation consuming ASDs. When I first saw this in the literature at the Indian Tea Association in Kolkata, I wondered if the ASD was some sort of sexually transmitted disease that I hadn't heard of. But of course, it stands for aerated soft drinks, and they're very evil. So the tea board launched a campaign about 10 years ago called Pio More Chai, which was obviously inspired by Pepsi's Ye Dil Mange More, right? It's English. And they've tried to capitalize on the idea that tea is healthy. But they're also facing now, of course, increasing competition from coffee, and now we have Starbucks in India allied with Tata as well. One other aspect, this is a kind of footnote to my study, is the phenomenon of chai in the West as a new item in coffeehouse culture in the West. And you have this very strange product that is sold all over the place, and people announce that they love it. It's heavily laced with aromatic spices, particularly clove, which I hardly know anybody in India who puts clove in chai. Maybe some people do, but it's certainly not common. Clove and stick cinnamon. To me, it tastes kind of like pumpkin pie or Christmas pudding, but it's very popular. And of course, you also have really weird things. You'll hear somebody order a vanilla soy green tea chai latte, right? Which is, really amazing to think of. This is a poster I saw in Australia. Try our chai, right? But the idea, I guess, is that if it's Indian, it has to reek of spices. It just has to really knock you over with spice. There is a lot of competition for chai now. And you have places like Cafe Coffee Day where the slogan, where a cup of coffee costs 10 times as much as the average street serving of chai, the cheapest cup of coffee, I should say. But despite the wishful slogan of Cafe Coffee Day, right? You know what it is. A lot can happen over coffee. It's basically true that in India, everything still happens over chai. Marriage negotiations, political machinations, gangland activities. Chai is the great lubricant. Business deals, political debates. It still happens, and not to mention university students getting to know one another. It still happens over chai. So I hope you will continue to enjoy it if you do. Thank you.